Chapter 15. It was less than an hour from the time for the first express rider to come galloping in from the south when Pat left Sam and Ezra at the little way station 10 miles south of Dutch Springs. The station itself consisted of a 2-room shack with beds in the rear room for the storekeeper and the riders who were laying over between trips. Behind the shack was a large corral and a feed shed for the carefully selected mounts for the fast mail service. The way the route would be ridden, as Pat understood it, was that Sam would be ready and waiting with a fresh horse saddled when the rider from the south completed his 10-mile dash at a breakneck speed. As he reached the station, he'd have his mail bags loose and ready to fling to Ezra, and without wasting a moment, Ezra would toss them behind Sam's saddle and he would gallop away on the next lap to Dutch Springs. The rider whom he was relieved would sleep at Ezra's station until Sam returned from Dutch Springs the next day with the southbound mail. It was a intricate and speedy process, carefully worked out by the government and requiring the services of many great men and horses, but it had already been proved feasible on the east-west route, and there was no reason why this new south-north feeder route should not prove just as viable. The riders were carefully selected for horsemanship and reckless courage, with none of them weighing over 135 pounds, while the station masters were required to be men of proven integrity, chosen for their ability of handling of men and horses. There was a curious air of tension about the little way station as Pat prepared to ride away. Both Sam and Ezra were having a hard time trying to act nonchalant as they waited for the first rider to gallop in from the south. They were both strongly conscious of the responsibility that rested upon them, and had an excited feeling of being part of something big and important in the growing up of the West. Today would mark an important milestone in the history of Powder Valley, and they were to have a part in making that history. Pat grinned down at them from the back of his bay mare as he paused to roll a final cigarette before riding away. "Sorry I won't be here to see you off, Sam. You figuring on hanging up a record on that ride into Dutch Springs?"
"I won't be riding out a walk," Sam told him.
"I've been thinking about things," Ezra broke in anxiously. "I sure hate to not be in Dutch Springs and see how things turns out. Don't suppose it'd be all right for me to mosey on in after Sam's took out with the mail? There won't be a blasted thing here for me to do till Sam gets back tomorrow." Pat licked his cigarette and shook his head. "You got your shop here, Ezra. You promised that when you took on the job." "I don't see why," Ezra said wistfully. "Because this is government business. If anything goes wrong at one station along the way, it throws the whole schedule off kilter. That's the reason why I wanted you boys to come back. Think what would happen if you two weren't here when that rider came in for an hour from now. The whole damn mail route would be ruined. Folks wouldn't be trusting their letters to go through and wouldn't pay the big money for speed. Damn it, you gotta realize the government's dependent on both of you." "Yeah, I reckon you're right," Ezra agreed. "By golly, think of her, Sam. The President of the United States will be waiting in Washington to hear what time you make on your run."
"Yeah, I've been thinking on that,"
Sam said in a surly tone. He looked up at Pat from beneath the brim of his Stetson.
"You gonna be in Dutch Springs when I ride in?"
"I reckon, unless you pass me on the way. And you're liable to do that if I don't get started. I ain't gonna ride this she-horse all too hard. Not after the way she brought me down over that rock slide."
"Yeah, you better be getting started," Sam agreed. "I'm gonna be riding like a streak of greased lightning when I get them mail bags on my saddle. Just give me room if you see me coming."
Pat Stevens nodded. "I'll see you in Dutch Springs, and you take it easy, Ezra. I got a hunch everything's going to be just all right. As he rode away, he wished it was more than a hunch. He thought he saw a way out of things, but shucks, it was just a lot of guessing. He needed something definite to back up his guesswork. And if he could get that, if a certain thing would happen during that Sam's ride into Dutch Springs. But he refused to let himself get too hopeful. It was a wild chance at best. He had to try bluffing it out if his hunch didn't come true, and bluffing is a tricky business. He spurred the willing mare into a lope as he left the way station behind. The road to Dutch Springs lay flat across the open prairie for a distance of some 5 miles. He wanted to be across the open expanse well ahead of Sam. There was a rough area of foothills and deep gulches through which the road passed after the open plain ended. This rough area was not more than a half-mile in width, and after the road passed it, there was ranch houses along the way leading into the outskirts of the village. If he made the ride on schedule, it would be just about dusk when Sam hit the broken stretch of country. That was the time and the place, if Pat's figuring was right. He held the mare to a lope all along the stretch of open country. The lower rim of sun was almost touching the topmost western peaks when he reached the beginning of the broken region. He slowed the mare to a trot and searched the terrain ahead and on either side of the road carefully. He could see nothing, but there were numerous deep gulches along the way that would afford perfect concealment for men and horses. The road wound around the base of a hill and dipped suddenly into a wide, dry wash lined with willows on either bank. Pat reined to the right off the road into the bottom of the dry wash. It was deep enough to hide him from the sight as he rode up 100 yards and around a bend that put him out of sight of the road. He dismounted and ground-tied the mare and pulled his carbine from the leather boot suspended from the saddle and crept up over the north bank of the wash carefully. He parted the thick growth of willows and peered out, nodded with satisfaction as he discovered his recollection of the terrain had been good, and he was directly south of the high rocky knoll that looked out over the entire expanse of the rough country. He pushed through the willows and bent forward to make his way up to the top of the knoll, dropping to his hands and knees as he neared the top, and then to his belly, wriggling forward until he could see over and get a clearer view of the road that was winding ahead in front of him. Only the upper half of the sun was visible as he settled himself into a comfortable position on his belly with his short rifle thrust out in front of him, resting on a boulder for steady shooting. He realized he was letting Sam take a terrific chance in riding unwarned into a possible ambush. But this was the best way Pat could figure to handle the situation. He couldn't warn Sam of possible danger without telling him everything he suspected, and he was loath to do that. He might so easily be wrong. If nothing happened, it would ruin everything he had told Sam. It was better this way. Sam would have to take his chance with possible dry gulchers. He had ridden into worse dangers before and come out unscathed. On top of the knoll with his saddle gun ready, Pat was in a commanding position to take hand on any trouble that might arise. He didn't want to scare them off if they were hidden down below, waiting for the Pony Express rider to come dashing through. The entire success of his plan depended upon them feeling safe to attack Sam as he rode by. It was sort of a making a death bait out of Sam SLOAN, but Pat knew that Sam would be the first to approve if he knew why he was being done. The sun was now below the western horizon. A red glow still lingered in the sky, touching the landscape with a rosy hue that reminisced of blood. There was a vast silence that seemed to intensify by the approach of darkness. As far as Pat could see in any direction, he could not perceive a single moving thing. It was as though the world stood perfectly still, catching its breath in anticipation of the deadly drama about to unfold here on the road into Dutch Springs. Not a superstitious man, Pat Stevens was deeply sensitive to the varying moods of nature, and he felt a sharpening of perceptions, a tightening of his muscles as the sun sank lower behind the mountains, and the blood hue slowly faded from the silent land. Into that graying silence came the faint drumming of galloping hoofs from the south. Pat felt a prickling sensation as though the short hairs in the back of his neck were standing up. The sound came louder, like the faint rolling of distant thunder. He twisted his head and saw a black speck far off on the ribbon-like road. The black speck grew swiftly larger, and the pounding of hoofbeats more tumultuous. Something inside Pat made him feel like standing up and waving his hat and shouting. He was seeing the first Pony Express rider in southern Colorado. The beginning of a new era in the West, as though it made him feel glad and triumphant and tremendously proud all at once. He could tell now that it was Sam SLOAN, leaning forward over the neck of his racing horse, pacing him carefully over the 10-mile grind to make the maximum speed without breaking his wind. Suddenly, horse and rider were lost from Pat's sight as the road dipped into a wide canyon behind him. Seconds later they leapt into view on the other side and over a ridge on an unslackened speed, and then down another short slope to another dry wash. Pat's gaze remained concentrated on the speeding mail rider, and every sense was alert. It wasn't taking long for Sam to dash across that dangerous half-mile of broken country, if something didn't happen soon. The crouching figure of Sam SLOAN disappeared into another canyon about a half-mile away, and as he went out of sight, Pat heard the sound he was waiting for and dreading, yet hoped he heard. The sharp crack of a rifle. Pat didn't breathe until horse and rider showed again on the other side. Sam was slung sideways in the saddle, and a 6-gun barking back at the point to his left and right. 2 other horses surged out into the dry wash a little west from the road. The twilight was thick enough to show orange flames leaping from their guns that were leveled at the express rider. One of the pursuing riders rode into the steady sights of Pat's rifle. He pressed the trigger gently, and the rider went headlong into the dust. The other was checking his plunging horse, turned to see from whence the new danger had come. Pat had time for careful aim, and even in the murky half-light of dusk, his bullet went where it was aimed. The second rider faltered in the saddle, slumped forward and fought to regain his balance, and then fell heavily onto the ground. His horse trotted on away from him, and the man half arose as though to follow, and then dropped to the ground again. The drumming of galloping hooves grew fainter. Sam was barely a discernible moving speck in the gathering dusk. True to the traditions of the Pony Express, he had not slackened speed for one instant. No matter how curious he might have been, he carried that mail northward, and nothing would have been allowed to slow it up. Pat got to his feet, trotted down to the slope to his mare. He vaulted into the saddle and sent her back to the road, and then headed northward. She snorted nervously and shied away when they came to a figure that was crumpled in the dust of the road, the first of the dry gulters to cross Pat's rifle sights. Pat steadied down the mare and then dismounted. Made a quick examination and found the man was quite dead. He rolled him over and nodded soberly when he recognized the dark, sneering features of a man known in Dutch Springs only as Mex Joe, a half-breed with a surly disposition and a ready gun hand who lived mostly by hunting and trapping, and was suspected of many minor crimes. Pat left Mex Joe laying in the road where he had fallen. He caught the reins of his mare, led her forward until he came to the second of the dry gulchers. Ben Larkin was nursing a shattered right shoulder and cursing loudly when Pat reached him. He was a burly, black-mustached man who owned a small, poverty-ridden spread on the little east of Dutch Springs. He greeted the sheriff with a snarl of hatred when Pat said soberly, "What you doing there sitting on the road, Ben?"
"You're smart, huh?"
roared the wounded man.
laying back there and shooting a man from behind. By God, if I could get a hold of a gun, I'd let you have her now.
Think you've done enough shooting for one night. Why don't you stand up? Pat told him.
Twisted my leg when I fell, Larkin muttered. Can't put my weight on it. You got me wrong. I didn't mean no harm. Was just funnin' when Mex Joe and me thought we'd scare Sam with the mail.
Who put you up to it? Pat demanded shortly.
Nobody. Honest to God, Pat.
Shut up. Only reason I didn't kill you was to leave you so you could talk. And you're gonna talk, Ben Larkin. Don't make any mistake about it. He turned, walked back to his mare, mounted and spurred after Larkin's roan saddle horse. He overtook the frightened animal a quarter of a mile down the road and dropped a noose over his head and led him back to Ben Larkin. When Larkin was beginning to whine for pity again, Pat slapped him savagely, told him to save his strength for a long time in jail. He hoisted the wounded man up into the roan saddle, using a rope and some half-hitches to secure him so he wouldn't fall off, and then set off at a gallop for Dutch Springs with the roan on a lead rope behind him. End of chapter 15.